My name is Wendy Patrick, and welcome to Courtroom Homeostasis, Best Practices for Workplace Wellness. I am joined by Dr. Robert Perkins, and we're going to be talking about a very important program that is integral for maintaining both physical and emotional well-being when your office is the courtroom. This non-traditional workplace includes a consistent group of trusted colleagues oftentimes, but often involves an unpredictable and often colorful cast of characters, depending on the kind of cases you hear in the courtroom. And accordingly, there's no typical day. But there are typical reactions to trauma. And I'm just going to toss this to Dr. Perkins. What are some of those typical reactions to trauma that many of us in a courtroom setting often end up suppressing rather than revealing?
Well, I think some of the most common, you can break them down into three categories. There'd be physical reactions, there's emotional reactions, and there's psychological reactions. So some of the more common physical reactions would be fatigue, upset in the digestive system, headaches, back pains, what would be perceived as sort of heart palpitations that maybe someone misinterprets as from an anxiety attack. Psychological signals of distress can be things such as the inability to sleep, the inability to rest. A person can have continual flashbacks or imagery of terrible and tragic things that they've gone. And then there's the emotional part. So when we're exposed to stress and trauma, there are chemicals that get released into our body that affect that part of our brain that regulates emotion. And so what you'll see is fluctuations of either people that are constantly sad or they'll cry for no reason, or the inability to sort of maintain your conduct, and you may lash out or you may become extremely angry, and that's really not indicative of what your normal sort of personality is. And when we're subjected to these things, it doesn't change our character per se, but our usual normal behavior has just been affected by how our body's being reacted to stress and trauma.
Although our bodies are reacting to stress and trauma, many people that work in courtrooms have learned to put forth a steely demeanor. They live and work in a fishbowl and they expect to always look and sound their best. How then do we, as concerned colleagues and supervisors, how do we catch the red flags that should tip us off that somebody is suffering from trauma, even though they might be doing their best to hold it inside?
Well, I think first we have to have a level of understanding that no matter how long we've been doing our profession, no matter how long we've been putting on that brave front, that all of these people, they're individuals, they're human beings, and every human being has a limited capacity for repressing and holding stress and trauma. It's different for some people. Some people can hold more than the others, but at some point in time, a person may reach their limit. And when they reach their limit, they're going to start to manifest these symptoms or these signals of distress. So I think having a level of awareness that we are human beings and that we do have a limited capacity, so that when this does happen to a coworker or when we see it happen to ourselves, we understand that this is normal behavior to an abnormal set of circumstances. And so we have to remember that we can't repress trauma. There is a cost to trauma on the human body. Every single person, no matter how tough they think they are, no matter how long they've been doing it, and there's a physical cost, there's an emotional cost, and there's a psychological cost. And the longer that we delay in processing or dealing with this stress and trauma, the greater the cost is going to be in the end for the time and the resources necessary to be able to bring us to that normal homeostasis or balance in our life.
Because this program will discuss courtroom homeostasis, balance in life, it will necessarily discuss practices, policies, and procedures that are designed to maintain that healthy homeostasis. Are there any, players in the courtroom, whatever roles they have, that might still worry about there being some sort of stigma attached by asking for help, by asking to speak with peer support, or by wanting to see a therapist or someone else to talk through some of the feelings they're struggling with?
You know, trauma in the courtroom is a different breed of cat because it does have some sort of situations that we don't find in other stressful environments. confidentiality for one. Adversarial players, I mean, you've got a judge and you've got a prosecutor and you've got a defense. You may have jurors, and there are lines in some of those relationships that can't sort of be crossed. And so that's why it's so important that this program is peer driven, being that we're not bringing in just sort of outside participants that don't really understand the nature of how people and the players and the stakeholders that work in the courtroom work. I think that we have to get past that stigma that, if I feel the need to reach out to somebody else, whether it be a therapist, whether it be a coworker, whether it be a chaplain or some sort of mental health professional, that's not a sign of weakness. I equate that when people start to feel these symptoms, this is like the check engine light coming on in your car. When the check engine light comes on, we just don't ditch the car. No, it's telling us something needs attention, and we take it to the place that's going to get that attention. So it's going to be able to resume that optimal performance.
And we continue to drive the car, which is important because I usually call this segment from verdicts to vacation. Sometimes when we leave the courtroom for a well-earned bit of time off, we tend to take that trauma with us. Even though the warning light's on, we continue to drive the car. But to what end and with what result when we bring that bottled up trauma home to our families?
There's a lot of similarities to human beings and trauma to automobiles. And in that we know that if we have an automobile, there are some preventative maintenance that we can do ourselves that really require very little expense and very little time that can prevent major catastrophes from happening. And when it comes to mental wellness and workplace wellness, it's the same thing. Certainly, there are going to be times when we're going to have to be reactive, and we're going to have to deploy tactics to deal with some huge issues that have sort of accumulated. But there are things that we can put in place proactively that won't eliminate, but it'll certainly diminish and mitigate the effects that these traumas and stresses will have on the individual on a daily basis, and also put into play techniques that are going to help keep that sort of balance, that homeostasis between a stressful work in the courthouse, and how do we maintain that sort of balance in our personal life without bringing that home to our friends or our families or repressing it inside.
One of the differences between cars and humans is cars don't heal. Humans do. But they first have to ask for help or seek help on their own. To what extent does one's home environment and willingness to open up to family members, to what extent can that either provide impetus for taking that preventative maintenance that might head off a collision to begin with, but also that healing process that may equip somebody to actually take a vacation and be refreshed and recharged to go back into court?
I think everyone has to have, I always refer to it that in case of emergency, break glass. I mean, we see that for fire, and behind that glass is a fire extinguisher or a fire alarm. But everyone has to have that, and what's behind the glass for you. So for some people, they can be in a position where they can share all of the things that they deal with on the daily with their spouse or with their family. There are other people that's just not really an option. And so I think it's very, very important that we have to have almost a battle buddy to be able to have that sort of person to be able to exchange, to be able to ventilate, and also an individual that, you know what, when we're in help, when we recognize something's wrong, we need that sort of help, to have that person to call that can provide us the help when we can't give it to ourselves.
You know, whether we call it a battle buddy or an accountability partner, this program will cover many different types of professionals that have their office as a courtroom. Everything from interpreters to bailiffs to clerks to witnesses to cops to jurors to lawyers, judges, and everyone in between. Battle buddies and accountability partners, however you look at it, are often people that do the same job you do, but maybe have different ways of dealing with the stress. For some people, maybe those that sought a career in law enforcement, you might imagine they have a higher tolerance for some of the traumatic footage, the blood, the types of things that go along with criminal cases, for example. example, than a juror who's never been in a courtroom before, much less signed up to be sent to a trial that is viewing some very sensational and gruesome evidence. Is there then a type of policy or procedure that covers everybody that is traumatized in a courtroom? Or might there be best practices that are industry specific?
Yeah, I think that any sort of trauma intervention program has to be fine-tuned to the individuals to whom are going to be receiving it. Certainly, jurors are under tremendous amount of stress and trauma, being that they probably never, for many jurors, they've never been in a courtroom before. And secondly, depending on the nature, the severity of the crime, how publicly this crime is in mainstream media, and then just the moral compass inside of them, their responsibility of determining the fate of this individual. And you combine all of those things together, those are compounded sort of layers of trauma. So I think that you can't have a one-size-fits-all trauma intervention program, but you have to have a program that's capable of molding and being sort of fine-tuned for the individuals, using the same sort of tenets of what's going to be helpful, but fine-tuning it to sort of the demographic of people that are going to be using it, to be able to bond those sort of peers together. And the other thing that the program's going to do is it's not only going to sort of mitigate all of those symptoms and free people from being paralyzed of it, it's going to reinforce normalcy. And it's also going to create a group cohesion, because in many of these cases, these are peers working together. And when people experience trauma, there's a tendency to sort of withdraw. So another benefit of this program is it will also promote the cohesion of the team in dealing with the stress and trauma together, instead of just keeping it inside individually.
The fact that some people tend to withdraw under trauma and under pressure brings up the other fact that this program will also deal with supervisors and managers and their additional responsibilities for monitoring and caring for subordinates, for the people they work with and people that work for them. In this respect, are there things that we can discuss perhaps with our team, with the people that we supervise, ahead of time? So if, God forbid, we should find that a coworker or a subordinate is withdrawing or is behaving differently or seems to be having emotional difficulties, if there's a way that we can, while respecting boundaries, if there's a way we can reach out to see if we may be of service.
I mean, there's a lot of truth to the expression, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So certainly by putting things into place prior to when they happen, is certainly going to save both time and money. And when it comes to managers and supervisors, it's very important for them to understand that, whenever a new trauma or an education or a program is put forth, there are two things that administrators automatically are going to start to look at, and that is cost. That's cost in time, and that's cost in dollars. And I really think about the fact that if you don't deploy these, what is the time in dollars and the time in work performance, in people booking off sick, and people not performing optimally, into retiring early? Attrition is a huge, huge expense. It's the largest expense in stressful occupations, where people, as a result of accumulated stress and trauma, can't do it anymore, and they leave. And the cost to hire, train, replace, and to get a person to that same level of experience is extremely high. So if we understand that studies have shown that when we deploy a trauma intervention program, such as Courtroom Homeostasis, that for every dollar that's spent, and that's in both time and monetary cost of such programs, for every dollar spent, average return on that is $7. So there's a 700% ROI, which you don't get in most programs. And you recognize those costs, recognize those savings in less sick time, in less early retirement, in less short-term, long-term disability, and in employee work performance. Because when an employee is not performing optimally, that's a cost if you have a poor performing employee.
It sounds like there's a balance between resolve and resilience. In other words, some employees may think, I'm just going to grin and bear it no matter what, where others might seek ways to bounce back from the trauma. From a managerial standpoint, courtroom homeostasis will talk through some of these issues and explore some of the ways in which supervisors and managers may try to manage their staff's trauma or anxiety or other types of emotions that might come to light. But is there a preference, if you're a manager or a supervisor, about whether you should seek employees that have the resolve to keep going or the resilience to sort of let it seep out other ways, maybe healthfully, like exercise, rather than potentially unhealthy habits that may be sought out to self-medicate?
I think if we look at, especially from a manager and a supervisory perspective, is the fact that there's a legal obligation from the state for an employer to provide a safe workplace. And if we think about the stress and trauma that's incurred, these are safety issues. And we have to look at what worst case scenarios have been to employees in many stressful occupations, where they became overwhelmed. The worst case scenarios that people have taken their lives. Suicide remains to be a very dominant reaction to people in positions where they are just expected, because of experience or because of stigma or because of culture, to just sort of carry on. When we realize this, and what is the cost of an employee's life, of an employee's taking their own life. So when we think about all of these elements, both preventively and reactively, in learning that you can improve employee performance, you can prevent incidents from your employees' performance from happening. You can prevent them from leaving, from booking off sick. But in many sense, there is an obligation of the employer to maintain that safe workspace. And we have to, although it's not the primary factor, it should be, what should be the primary factor is that you care about the well-being of your employees. But when you combine the goodwill, corporate goodwill of the well-being of your employees, combined with the ROI that this will give you, and you complement that with the obligations legally of an employer to provide a safe workspace, combined, courtroom homeostasis is a very beneficial package.
So, courtroom homeostasis, this is going to discuss the different roles of courtroom employees, how vicarious trauma impacts different types of employees differently, indications of burnout or mental overload, how stress and anxiety take a toll both professionally and personally, and courtroom-related challenges to work-life balance. It sounds like we're going to have a lot to talk about.
A lot, vicarious trauma especially. The two occupations that tie for the highest proponents of people that suffer from vicarious trauma are social workers and judges, specifically family court judges. And, in the public perception, we won't really think about judges as being, we think about them as this sort of tough individual that's, like a stone, nothing's going to affect them. And some of the things and responsibilities that they're responsible for doing, whether it's incarcerating someone, whether it's making a decision if this person is guilty or not guilty, with victims in the courtroom, this stress is tremendous. And family court judges are the number one in the legal profession, people that are the most susceptible to contracting vicarious trauma.
Vicarious trauma strikes me as something that also may result from something being unexpected. And many of the players in a courtroom are routinely exposed to the unexpected. Somebody runs for judge or wants to get an appointment to be a judge, and maybe their passion is sitting on bankruptcy cases, and here they do a rotation in family court, totally unexpected. A juror reports for jury duty thinking maybe she's going to hear a shoplifting case and get sent to a courtroom where they're doing a serial child abuse murder case. Or you're in law enforcement and you respond to a house and think you don't know what's behind that door. It could be a bottle of drugs or a dead body. It's the unexpected. It's the never being able to anticipate or control your circumstances. No doubt that also factors into some of the vicarious trauma that's suffered by almost everybody that works in a courtroom, isn't it?
Absolutely. There is no way to train a person or to prepare a person for some of the stress and the trauma that is going to be experienced, with the exception of at least giving them a sense of awareness that when the body is exposed to things that are not normal, there's going to be a reaction. And by teaching people that when they experience that reaction, that that's normal and that they're not weak, and that when they do experience it, that there's a process that has to happen for it to be able to be processed effectively, and for it not to become a stumbling block for them later on, both in personal life and professional life, and in their mental well-being.
The way people process stress and anxiety is so different person to person. I mean, everything from pills to pot to Peloton. People process through stress differently. This program will explore some healthy ways to process trauma, stress, and anxiety collaboratively, cooperatively, in order to reach those that may, before going to this program, have been at odds or been at a dead end regarding where do I go with these feelings? Who do I talk to about it? And most importantly, what do I do about it? How do I show up tomorrow when I barely make it through today? So those will be some of the issues that we'll be discussing in Courtroom Homeostasis, won't we?
Absolutely.